All right, we are live, I guess. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen. Can everyone see?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay. Now we're gonna try this again. I remember last time we had some issues, kind of. So you all can see this, right?
Yes, at least I can.
Yeah, I can see.
Okay, cool. So today we're gonna be talking about, or the lab we're gonna be doing today is flowers and fruits. Historically, these two labs were separated, but given the current circumstance, we are going to sort of combine them. So first I'm going to talk about flowers and then I'll talk about fruits. But essentially, this is a really, looks like a complex slide, but there are many different parts of a flower, but they're all different modifications of leaves, essentially, evolutionarily. And, one way to think about a flower is to think about it as a strobilus, right? Just as we had in the lycophytes and just as we had in the conifers. But just imagine that it's bisporangiate. So it has microsporophylls, right? Sporophylls that are going to make microsporangia and microspores, and megasporophylls, right? Sporophylls that are going to make megasporangia and megaspores, right? Those are the ovules. The megasporangia and the megaspore in the ovule. And then if you just, sort of really just broaden your conception of what a strobilus is, right? What a leaf is, it's not too difficult to make all of these different organs, right? Like, have you ever, if you ever seen a green bean, right? If you split open a green bean like this, you have the ovules, the C's lying down the center. And if you sort of squint your eyes a little bit, it just looks like a leaf. It's a leaf that sort of has, sporangia on the bottom. And then if you just fold it up, that's a carpel, right? So that's it's just a leaf. It's a megasporangiate leaf, right? A megasporophyll. And we have a specific name for the megasporophyll, and for different parts of the megasporophyll. But in the broad sense, we call this part the pistil, right? It's comprised of the stigma. So this is sort of the upper pollen receptive portion. The style, which is the neck that sort of connects the base of the ovary to the stigma. And then the ovary itself, which is composed of the, like I said, the megasporophylls. It could be one, right? Then it would be one carpel, one ovary. Well, we'll get into the difference between ovaries and carpels, but essentially you have the ovary, which can be composed of one carpel or multiple. And then within those, within the ovary are the ovules. And then sort of working our way out, I guess, from that is we have the male reproductive portions, right? We have the microsporangiate reproductive portions. And these are the stamen. So the stamen are composed of a few different structures. So if we zoom in on them here, we have the anthers, which are these sort of yellow structures, and those sort of, like, in the strict sense, are just the portions where the microsporangia are born, right? And then you can see the microsporangia are sort of in here, and then so what will happen is through meiosis, you'll develop microspores, and then they will divide to produce microgametophytes within the spore wall, and those are pollen grains, essentially. The other part of the stamen is the filament, and that's just the portion that holds up allows the anther to stick out, or allows the anther to stick out above the flower. So the other, generally what we think of as, the most showy parts of the flower, although it's not entirely true in every flower, are the perianth whorls. So the perianth whorls, as you can see here, there are two whorls in the perianth. There are the petals, which together form the corolla. So one petal is one petal, but if you're talking about the whole petaloid structure itself with all the different petals, then it would be termed the corolla. And then the things, so moving outward once more, the sort of green leafy structures that subtend the flower they're called the sepals. And again, individually they're sepals, but together we talk about them as the calyx. So that's the basic form of a flower. There's a lot of terminology, but it's nothing new, right? It's megasporangia, microsporangia, megasporophylls, microsporophylls, and leaves, right? There's no de novo, and then ovules, right? So we learned about how all these things arise. So there's nothing necessarily novel about the flower. It's just sort of how they're doing it, right? How they're putting things together. Right. So because you have all of these specific structures, right? You have these particular structures that the microspores are born on, specific structures that the megaspores are born on, et cetera, et cetera. Then you can sort of modify these things. And that's where we get the exceptional diversity of floral morphology. But we can categorize floral morphology in a few ways. So one of the main differences, one of the broadest difference, is asking what is the symmetry of the flower. Is it radially symmetric, which is termed actinomorphic? So you can see here are some radially symmetric flowers, right? Anyway, so essentially what that means is if you put a dot in the middle of the flower and you essentially cut it in any way, it would look exactly the same on both sides, right? So imagine putting a flower here, you cut it in any plane, and it would be essentially identical. I mean, you could imagine cutting things in particular ways, but it's essentially when things are radially symmetric. And that's, again, termed actinomorphic. And this is fundamentally distinct from the other type of floral symmetry, which is called zygomorphic or bilaterally symmetric. So right, in all of these flowers, it's pretty clear that you can only cut it in one plane for it to be symmetrical on both sides. And of course, this is like not a perfect dichotomy between actinomorphic and zygomorphic, but it generally holds up in a lot of cases, and it's just an easy way to sort of group floral morphology. Yeah, so here's a spiral symmetry. I would suggest that these are more or less radially symmetric, but like I said, there are things that sort of, there's a big gray zone. You can think of it as a spectrum where you have bilateral on one side and radially symmetrical on the other side, and there are things sort of in the middle of that span that spectrum. So another really important character in not only floral morphology, but also in describing or grouping plant clades, like large angiosperm groups, is the fusion of floral organs, right? And the fusion, generally we think of the fusion of petals, but you can have the fusion of many other organs. So, but essentially, when any floral organ, or really any organ in general, is fused to another one of itself, so like if multiple petals are fused, as you see here, or as you see here, we call that connation or connate, right? And this is, again, distinct from what we term adenate or adenation, which is non-like floral organs or non-like organs fusing together, right? So So connation is like organs fusing together, and adenation is non-like organs fusing together. So I think it's easy to think of, in connation, petals, sepals, stamens, carpels can all be connate. And then adenation is a little bit more complex, so essentially you would say that, the petals are connate, but the stamens are adenate to the petals, right? You can see that here on the left, that the stamens are adenate to the petals. Or here in the center in this hibiscus, you would say two things actually. You would say, one, the stamens are connate to themselves, right? Because they essentially form this tube where they're all attached to. And secondly, you would say that stamen tube is adenate to the style. And you can see that here. And then here on the right, sort of everything is fused together, and we give that a particular name, which I will go over later, I think in the slides. If not, I will talk about that. Oh yeah, no, we do go over them in the slides, so I'll talk about that. So in addition to fusion, we can also have the multiplication of organs. So we can have, this is frequently seen in horticultural varieties or in cut flowers, where you have essentially, like this is frequent in roses. Roses usually, naturally only have one whorl of petals, but in cultivation, most of the roses you get have multiple whorls of petals, and we as humans, I guess, think they look nice to us, so that's why we breed them for that trait. But it adds to the diversity of floral morphology, and you can have duplication of stamens as well. So if you have duplication of organs, then you essentially evolution can act on different particular whorls, right? So frequently we see this in the stamen whorl. When there are multiple whorls of stamens, you can have an inner whorl, which look like this. Believe it or not, this is actually a whorl of stamens. This sort of papery structure on the left that's surrounding the carpels. It is the innermost whorl of stamens, but over evolutionary time, they've become highly modified and papery, and they are definitely not functional, right? You can even see sort of these tips, maybe these yellow tips at the top are aborted anthers. I'm not entirely sure. This is Aquilegia, so Elena or Molly or Minya or Grace would know, but essentially this is an inner whorl of stamens. And then you can see on here on the right, you have this, I can't tell if it's the outer or inner whorl, but you have one whorl of stamens, which look like this, right? These sort of star-shaped, green blobs with all these little, I believe, nectaries that are sort of popping out. And these are obviously not functional reproductively, but they probably serve a function. Their functional purpose is probably as a source of nectar for pollinators or something like that. And then you can see this other whorl of stamen they look nice and reproductive and functional reproductively. So that's just another way you can add floral diversity. Oh, there you go. Yeah, so they're nectaries, staminodes, etc. So I don't know if you all remember when Elena talked about the ABC model of floral development, but essentially it's arguably a relatively simple model where you have different differential gene expression in the different layers. And because there's some overlap in some of those genes, you can actually modify particular organs to become other organs. So this is termed homeosis. And frequently what you can do is you can modify stamens. So like I said, this is a naturally occurring rose, wild variety. I think it's probably Rosa rugosa. And you can modify the stamen whorls, to become petals. And that's just a simple change in gene expression. So again, you can see that that here they're doing the same thing with these petal whorls, and it creates what I think most humans or some humans would agree are relatively beautiful cultivars, but it's just this transformation of an organ type or organ whorl to another organ type. Yeah, and then you have some weird some weird flowers. So this is passion fruit or passion flower. If you've all ever seen this, the fruit is delicious and the flowers are insane. So essentially, it's such a weird structure. You have these whorls of what we call tepals, which I didn't talk about. So like I said, the outer whorl are called sepals. Those are the leafy things. The inner whorl are called petals. But when the petals and the sepals look similar, there's no distinct differentiation, we tend to cluster them all together and call them tepals. T-E-P-A-L, tepals, yeah. Now, the thing with passion fruit or passiflora, passion flower, is that it has this, well, let me talk about this thing that's termed the corona last. It's called the corona. But essentially, you have this really interesting stalk-like structure. So, you might ask, what is going on here? So essentially, you have this stalk, and on the stalk, you have both the stamen and the carpels all attached to this one structure that's generally called a gynophore. So if it's actually called an androgynophore, but that's because you have both the andrecium. So I didn't bring that term in just because it's not extremely necessary, but the andrecium is the male structures as a whole. Just think of it as the stamens. And then the gynecium, which I didn't bring that term in and it's not important, is the female structures as a whole. So when you have them, and then, right, what does the term phore mean? P-H-O-R-E, it means sort of like a structure or a bearer. So gynophore is a structure that bears the gynecium, and an androphore is a structure that bears the andrecium. But because this structure bears both the gynecium and the andrecium, we generally cluster them together and call it the androgynophore. You don't need to know that term, but it's just for your information. So essentially, these purple structures here are the styles, right? And then the receptive, sort of grayish purple portions at the tips are the stigmas. And then down here, each of these, there's 3 lobes of this carpel, of this ovary. So you have 3 fused carpels. You can think of my fingers as the carpels, and they're just fused together like that. I don't know if you can see me, but that's what's going on there. And then these structures here, it's relatively simple. Here you have the filament, and here you have the anther. So you have a bunch of them. So it's not terribly crazy, but what is weird is the corona, which is this star-like projection, and I'm not entirely sure if anyone knows what this is derived from, but it's probably just some sort of cell expansion and division and just outgrowth of maybe the base of the petals or something like that. Who knows? But it's weird.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
I don't know if you mentioned this earlier, and if you did, I'm really sorry I missed it. But as for the corona, do you know if any other types of flowers other than passion fruit flowers have them?
Yeah. Well, there are things that we call the corona in other plants. Whether they're the same thing, I'm not entirely sure. I think you might want to Google this, but I think in daffodils, the narcissus, we call the sort of, that inner tube a corona. I'm not entirely sure, but yes, to answer your question, there are things like this in other plants, but generally I think we know what they're derived from, like, that's the fusion of the petals or whatever. But this in passiflora, it's a little bit more obscure, and maybe there's research out there that I just haven't read yet about what the actual corona is, but I don't know right now. Maybe I'll investigate. It could be
okay. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So I'm not a huge fan of these floral diagrams, but uh, they, once you sort of actually learn what's going on in them, they make a lot of sense. But there's sort of a way that people like to keep track of things, and there's, if you take a picture of a flower, and then you take a picture of another flower, how are you going to compare them, right? They're so different and all that stuff. So there's the standardized way that people have decided to compare flowers, and it's through these floral diagrams. And the way to read these floral diagrams, I guess it's probably easiest starting from the inside and going out. Is the inside is almost always the like I said, the gynecium, or the female portion, right? It's the carpels, it's the ovary. And you can see that, okay, well, what's going on here? I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I have 5 carpels, and they seem all to be fused. So sometimes, so I think when I was first learning botany and angiosperms and stuff, something that really threw me off was the distinction between carpels and ovaries and the pistil and stuff like that. And it can get a little complicated, but essentially the pistil is sort of like the whole thing, the whole female, it's like the whole female portion. And then carpels are individual, you can think of them as the individual megasporophylls, right? So a megasporophyle can have multiple, well, it's actually a little broader. It's like the megasporophyll that's holding other megasporophylls, kind of. But essentially, just think of it about like this. Ovaries are comprised of carpels, and when those carpels are fused, we call it like one ovary. But you can have multiple individual carpels that are not fused, and I'll get into that. But it gets a little complicated, and maybe I confused you a little more, but hopefully I'll clarify this in further slides. But anyway, so the innermost portion, again, is the female portion. These are the carpels and the ovary. And then outermost, or outer to that, you have the stamens, right? And then outer to that, you have the petals. And then outer to that, you have the sepals. And then outer to that, if there's anything outer to that, you'd have like a subtending leaf or something like that. So for instance, if we were to look at this one right here, we would say, okay, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sepals that are not fused, right? They're not fused. Why would I say that? Because they're not fused, clearly. And then inner to that, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 petals, and they are also not fused. Now, if we look inner to that, we have, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 10 or so stamens that are fused, right? And you can see that they're fused like this. And then inner to that, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 5 carpels that may or may not be fused. They look fused, but they could separate when the fruit is ripe. But anyway, that's how you read floral diagrams. And just to kind of confuse things a little more, floral diagrams can be very, very confusing. And there are many of them, and I don't think we have any of these in our labs, and I don't think you're going to need to know this, but that this is just how people keep track of floral morphology. Okay, so frequently, actually, not sometimes, but frequently, we can get tricked by what we call, quote unquote, flowers. And, if you were hopefully, in the beginning of this class, you would, of this whole class, you might walk up to this plant and say, oh, look at this beautiful flower. But actually now, because you have your botanical boots on or whatever, you would look at this and say, well, this is actually not one flower. It's an inflorescence. There are multiple flowers here, and these showy things are actually leaves. These are and when we have showy leaves that subtend inflorescences or flowers or whatever, we tend to call them bracts, B-R-A-C-T-S. And you can see that these are this is an inflorescence and not one flower because you have all of these individual flowers here. As you can see, these are kind of spent. The petals are starting to fall off, but on some of these younger ones, you can see the petals. So that's how we know that this is an inflorescence and that these are actually subtending leaves. The same is true with with sunflowers, right? So you might look at a sunflower, and even in the name, right? So it actually should be called a sun inflorescence because each of these individual structures is the flower, and even these what we call ray flowers are on the outside, and they have. So this is kind of going back to our idea of radially versus bilaterally symmetrical flowers. So the flowers these are called disc flowers in the head or in the capitulum are radially symmetrical, right? You can cut them in any way, shape, or form, and they'll be symmetric on either side. But the ray flowers are actually zygomorphic, right? They have this massive, one of these massive petal lobes that that is really large. So it's obviously not zygomorphic, but essentially it's actually a sunflower is an inflorescence, not a simple flower.
Wait, sorry, I have a question.
Yeah.
So that, like, the giant petals of what we think of as a sunflower are actually just like giant petals on tiny flowers?
Yep. Here, so I'll show you in here. So you see this right here on the left?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that is a giant petal lobe on a tiny flower, pretty much.
How does it like signal and say like, oh, I'm on the outside, I should get a giant petal?
That is a good question. I'm not sure. That's an Elena question. But you know, it's definitely just something to do with the probably hormonal, genetic signaling, cell differentiation, and cell determination, and things like that. But and I don't even know if anyone has looked in specifically into it, but yeah, it's just the natural development of those outer whorls versus the inner whorls. And I'm not entirely sure how they know, but they do for most things. But clearly, right, we can through you know breeding and artificial selection, we can modify these sunflowers to create either all ray flowers or all disc flowers, things like that. And again, I would say that this is a nice looking flower inflorescence, right? It's a nice looking cultivar, so that's why we would breed some of these this way. But clearly, it has to do with because we can modify these flowers into being either all disc or all ray flowers. It has to do with the expression patterns in those flowers, right? In the cells of those flowers. So yeah, it probably has something to do with that, but I'm not entirely sure about the actual mechanism. And then there are some crazy looking flowers. So this is a parasitic plant. So actually, this plant right here on the left, and this plant right here on the right, Rafflesia. These are actually parasitic plants, and they don't produce anything except for flowers. It's kind of crazy. And you can see that they look super weird. And you might ask, like, why do they look like that? Well, if you squint your eyes a little bit, and if you were around them, you might say, well, if you were around them, you would definitely know the reason why they look like this. So they frequently smell like rotting meat, and they are fly pollinated. And if you squint your eyes a little bit, it looks like rotting flesh, kind of. So that's sort of the idea there. And then you have all these crazy flowers. So this is one of my favorite plants, actually, Psychotria. It's a coffee relative. You see it frequently in it's a nice understory tree in the neotropics. And I think there are some in the paleotropics as well. And then I've never seen these. I don't know where they are from, but these are monkey face orchids, and you can clearly see where they get their name from. I don't think that has any adaptive significance. I don't think they're trying to mimic anything there. I think it's just something that happened over evolutionary time for perhaps their pollinators, and we just happened to pick up on the cue that they look like something that we're familiar with. I think it's more of a, them having a monkey face is more of a human tendency to look at things and see similarities than it is anything adaptive about the having a monkey face on your flower. Okay, so now we're going to talk about fruits. So, like I said earlier, or I don't know if I said this, but a fruit is just a mature ovary with seeds inside, right? So it starts off as the ovary, and then when everything's fertilized and it's developing and it's ready for dispersal, it becomes the fruit. There's nothing magical happens. Well, I guess fertilization happens, which is, you can say it's magical. So there is a tremendous amount of fruit morphology, just as there is in floral morphology. And there are many things that affect or influence fruit morphology. These include carbal fusion, placentation, which is the placement of the ovules in the carpels, and we'll get into that. It can be fleshy versus dry fruit. It can be dehiscent versus indehiscent. Ovary position, so is the ovary above the flower or below the flower? And by the flower, I mean the other petal whorls. And then do other parts of the inflorescence or the stem or the plant contribute to the fruit itself? And we'll get into that as well. Okay, so this is sort of what I was talking about before, right? You can have things that have either one carpel, which are, if you have a plant that has one carpel, it's always, well, it's not entirely true, but like let's think of a peach, right? Or any stone fruit, really. So there's one carpel in there, and it's fused. But if you have more than one carpel, you can sort of do a few things with it. You can fuse it. You can fuse all of those carpels, and then you create this one essentially compound ovary, right? It has multiple carpels fused, and if you squint, you can see, there's one carpel, there's one carpel, and there's one carpel. You can sort of have semi-fusion of your carpels, which you see here in the star fruits, or this, I think this is anise or something, where you have, they're fused sort of at the base, but then they're free as you move up. Or you can have just completely unfused carpels, which you see here, right? And you can have everything in between. Okay. So, like I said, placentation is how the ovules are attached to the ovary. So this has always been something for me as well that's been like kind of, sometimes it's hard to see and it's really difficult, but and it's not really it's rarely do I use it in the field as like a diagnostic character for a group, but it is important, in many ways. But you can sort of have a whole bunch of different ways you can attach your ovules to the ovary. So one of these ways is free central. So you have this column, and then all of your ovules are attached to this column. You can have parietal, which I think that's what we had, or no, that's not what we had there, or maybe that was. We have parietal, where you're just attached to sort of the edges of the carpel. There's axial, which is essentially, you can think of it as free central, but with particular locules, if you will, or particular, carpels. Like this would be one carpel, this is another carpel, this is another carpel. The issue is that sometimes you can have carpels that are one carpel, but they actually get broken up into multiple locules. So that's actually something that's a little bit more confusing with fruit morphology, but don't worry about it. Then you can have, apical, basal, things like that. So it is an important character for many groups, but it's a little bit more subtle because you can't, see it. It's not as apparent as having a dry or a fleshy fruit. Well, great segue. So fruits can either be dry or fleshy. So I think many of the fleshy fruits, fleshy fruits are a little bit more, something we think about a little more just because we eat, oranges and peppers and bananas and raspberries and strawberries and tomatoes and things like that. But there are many, many, many fruits. I don't know the proportion in terms of diversity, but there are quite a number of dry fruits. Many legumes are dry fruits. Magnoliids have dry fruits, so the magnolias and stuff. Almost all sunflowers or asteraceae have dry fruit. Maples, many things have dry fruits. And we generally categorize dry fruits, or really all fruits, in a few different ways. You can be dry and dehiscent, or you can be dry and indehiscent. So dry dehiscent fruits are, I don't know if you've ever seen like a milkweed, but generally milkweeds open along one axis. And then we have all these terms for these different things. Capsules, everything in the pea family is called a legume, and there's follicles. I've never really liked fruit morphology fruit terms because they're not homologous, and it's rarely not everything with a samara is the same samara. It's multiple origins and stuff. And then you have dry indehiscent fruits, so like grains or nuts. Or achenes, right? These dry one-seeded fruits. So yeah, essentially you can have dry dehiscent and dry indehiscent, and almost all of your fleshy fruits are going to be indehiscent, but there are some fleshy dehiscent fruits, but it's much rarer. And the idea here is, if you have a fleshy fruit, you're probably going to have, if you have a dry fruit, and if you have a dry dehiscent fruit, you're probably most of the time going to be dispersing your seeds by the air or something like that, or the ocean or whatever. Now, with fleshy fruits, you're most likely going to have an animal disperser, and there's no point in having a dehiscent fruit to open your ovary to release your spores if you're just going to have if you've evolved a commensal relationship with a fruit dispersing herbivore, right? So that's why most fleshy fruits are indehiscent. Okay, so I think I briefly talked about this, but the position of your ovary is important, and it can be in many different places. So I think the classic flower looks something like this right here, where you have your sepals, your petals, your stamens, and then your ovary right here. This is like a I guess something like this too, right? These two are your classic ovary positions, and this is superior. This would be termed a superior ovary, right? So the ovary. So when I say a superior ovary, I don't mean that it's better than an inferior ovary. I just mean that the ovary is on top of or above the sepals and the petals and the anthers, right? The other floral parts. And this is generally, so we have a specific name for it. We call it hypogynous, right? So the floral parts are below the ovary, hypogynous. And then perigynous. So the names for these different things going on with the flower have to do with A, the position, and B, what's going on with the other floral organ. So if we have a superior ovary, but we have fusion of all of the other floral parts into a what's termed a hypanthium, which I'll talk about in a bit, it's called perigynous. And then on the other hand, we have inferior ovaries, right, where the ovary is below the floral parts. And you can just see that here really, really nicely. And there are ways when looking at the fruit to actually tell whether it's an inferior ovary or a superior ovary. And I'll get into that. So the hypanthium. The hypanthium is a really, really cool structure. And we don't really know how it forms, but essentially it's a fusion, and it actually it occurs in many different lineages. It's really popular in the it's really prevalent in the Rosaceae, the rose family. But essentially, all it is a fusion of all of the petal whorls. Except, I mean, not always the ovary. It's a fusion of the sepals, the petals, and the stamens, at least. And hypanthia can occur with superior ovaries or with inferior ovaries. And it just depends on the fusion of the floral organs. And the reason why I say, we don't really know, in many different lineages, we don't really know what the hypanthium is evolutionarily similar to, what it's homologous to, is because, this structure here, right? The structure that bears the other floral organs, is this homologous with petal tissue? Is this homologous with receptacle tissue, right? The base of the flower? Is it homologous to sepal tissue? We just don't know. But it's a really, really cool structure that I've always been interested in, the hypanthium. So here's a really nice photo of a hypanthium, right? Like this is like this is like textbook hypanthium. You have this tissue that extends above the flower, and then you have the fusion of the sepals, the petals, and the anthers, the stamens, all on this structure. And we term this structure the hypanthium. This is a prunus, this is a peach or a plum. And you can see that this is superior with a hypanthium, right? Okay, so this here in the middle, this is an inferior ovary, right? And you might ask, well, how do I know that this is an inferior ovary? Well, we can see that the sepals. So this is I think this is what is this, a monocot? No, this is a cucurbit, a cucumber family thing, squash or something. And you can see that all of the floral parts are attached at the top of the ovary, the top of the fruit. So that is an inferior ovary, and we call that epigynous or epigynous. And then on the other side, we have this flower where all of the floral organs are attached on the bottom. So that is a superior ovary, and we call this hypogynous. So that's sort of the idea there. Yeah, those are the fruit. Okay, so we also talked about the different layers of a fruit. You have an exocarp, a mesocarp, and an endocarp, and it's not always really easy to tell those different layers apart. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. But essentially, the exocarp is the outermost portion of the fruit. The mesocarp is the middle, and it's generally fleshy. And the endocarp is the innermost portion of the ovary or of the carpel. And it can be modified. It can either be papery or it can be stony and hard like this. Like in an avocado, that inner like papery layer around the actual seed, I'm pretty sure that's the endocarp. So it has a papery, it's a berry with a papery endocarp. So yeah, right. So we have the exocarp, the mesocarp, and the endocarp, and that's what's going on with drupes. And the reason why, you would say, well, why isn't this the seed? Well, it's because if we crack this thing open, we have a perfectly good seed. We have going from outside in, we have the integuments, we have the megasporangium, we have the, not at this stage, but we have the megagametophyte, which is, 8 cells or 7 cells, 8 nuclei. And then we have the endosperm and the and the embryo all in the seed. So it's clear this is clearly not the seed. It's clearly derived from the carpel, the fruit. Okay. Yeah. So in tomatoes, we have the exocarp is sort of the outer skin of the tomato berry, and then the mesocarp is sort of all of this fleshy structure, and then where the endocarp is, I'm not entirely sure, but it's in things like, and this is also not a great example because this is a cultivated variety of tomato where all of the locules and carpels are all sort of messed up. So it's not really a good example to look at the endocarp of. But this is just an example to show you that well, first of a fleshy mesocarp, and that sometimes it's really difficult to distinguish between the different layers of the carpel, the exocarp, the mesocarp, and the endocarp. Now, as botanists, we like to give things terms, and we call everything that's a citrus a hesperidium. It's just a berry with a leathery rind. That's all it is. It's a berry with a leathery exocarp. So essentially, in a citrus, you have this leathery rind, the exocarp. You have this sort of spongy white tissue. I don't know if you ever had it. Or like smelled it or tasted it. It's very bitter generally. And then you have these individual carpels, right? So each of these sections in the citrus is a carpel. Okay, so this is a fruit that has, I don't know what's 10 or 8 or 7 carpels, but they're like semi-fused, right? You can peel the individual carpels apart, and that's what we eat. And remember, the juicy part that we eat in a citrus, those are actually modified hairs. Really weird. Modified, fleshy, juicy hairs, which is a really weird thing to think about, and they're not, it's just, this is what it is. So you're eating juicy hairs when you're eating a clementine or a citrus or anything like that. Now, apples, we give them their own name. We call them pomme, which I think is, apple in French or something like that, or other languages. But the apple is really cool because the majority of the flesh of an apple is actually not the ovary. It's actually the hypanthium. And you can actually see this. So do you all see this line right here?
Yeah, it's going around the two seeds, kind of.
Yeah. So the one outside of it, not the inner one, but the broader one.
Yeah, the one that's a little bit wider.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
So that is actually the ovary. Okay. And everything outside of the ovary is hypanthial tissue. It's the hypanthium. So this is all like just modified tissue that is adding to the apple. And generally, if you're eating apple, once you get to this part, you kind of like stop eating it for the most part, unless you're really hungry. And then you kind of, compost it or whatever. But this outer portion, which we mostly like to eat, is all receptacular tissue, right? It's all receptacle derived from the hypanthium. So that's kind of a really interesting fun fact to impress your friends when you're eating an apple or when they're eating an apple, or annoy them, whichever you want to do. And B, it sort of really articulates how you can add to fruit diversity by expanding on the different parts of the fruit, right? So that's what's going on here. And again, if we were to say, okay, well, what did the flower look like on this? Well, this is the stalk. It was clearly attached to the plant from here. So that means the top of the flower was here. And you might ask, okay, well, is this a superior or an inferior ovary? Well, we see that the calyx, right, the sepals are attached up here. So that's those little like hairy, leafy bits at the bottom of the apple. That's actually remnants of the calyx, the sepals. And because it's all fused around the ovary, you would say that this is an inferior ovary here. Things between inferior and superior get a little dicey when you're working with the hypanthium, but that's just something to remember. Yes, and so we call watermelons and other things that have thick rinds peepos. I don't know why. Oh, I think I looked it up during lecture. I think it comes from the um, I think it comes from the Greek. There was a term like peepo something, and it meant like, I don't know, watermelon or something like that. I don't know, but essentially, it's we just call this it's a berry is really all it is, but it has a thick leathery rind, or sorry, a thick rind, not a leathery rind. So you have Hesperidia and peepos, which are both berries, but they're just slightly different, right? This is why I don't really like fruit terminology, because it's like, well, they're both berries, so why don't we just call them berries? But you know, whatever. It's helpful, I guess. So there are other types of fruits. There are fruits that are derived from either multiple flowers or an aggregate of ovaries. So this is a fundamental difference, right? So so an aggregate fruit is, so let's take a step back. So let me take a step back here. So an aggregate fruit is a fruit that has many individual ovules, individual ovaries that are fused together. So it's one flower, many like fruitlets, I guess. This is fundamentally different from a multiple fruit, which is one fruit that's derived from many flowers. Does that make sense? We'll get into that in a second. But essentially, with a strawberry, the idea here is that each of these little brown things that get stuck in your teeth are small fruits. This is one fruit right there. This is one fruit right there. And it's derived from one flower. And all of these are individual carpels, right? Where there was a style and a stigma on each of these little fruits. They all are, you would say that these are separate, simple carpels, right? They're not fused to each other, but they are embedded in this tissue that we eat. And this tissue is the receptacle. So it's all these fruits. It's an aggregate of fruits on one receptacle. So that's an aggregate fruit. And other fruits like this are raspberries. So if we look right here, each of these is a little easier to sort of conceptualize this. Each of these little, balls of the raspberry are actually individual carpels. They're separate and they're simple carpels. And then as the fruit grows, it develops and matures, and then they kind of fuse together. So it's an aggregate of berries. Okay. And that's fundamentally different from a strawberry, which is an aggregate of achenes. Okay. And an achene is just one-seeded dry fruit. It's nothing, I don't know. It's nothing particularly interesting, but, I don't know if have you all ever gone raspberry picking?
I haven't.
So you have or haven't?
No. I've seen raspberries, but I haven't gone raspberry picking.
Okay, so essentially, if you pull a raspberry off of the stalk, there's a little white portion that sort of like stays in. Like my hand is the raspberry, and this is the stalk. There's a little white portion that stays in the that sort of gets pulled out, and that white portion is actually the receptacle. So if you just imagine that it's interesting because in the raspberry we're eating the ovaries, the modified carpels, and in the strawberry we're eating the receptacle. So it's kind of like the opposite. It's really interesting. So then multiple fruits, like I said, are the formation of one fruit from multiple flowers. So this happens like in this pineapple. So each of these little hexagonal pieces in the pineapple was actually one flower. and there's a stalk that runs through it, right, that holds up all the flowers. So if you Google a picture of a pineapple flower, or type in pineapple, flower or inflorescence, you'll see a really beautiful structure that kind of looks reminiscent of the pineapple. But it has these individual hexagonal sort of pieces are what were the flower, and then each of these is an individual ovary, and they all fuse together. So multiple fruit is derived from many flowers, and an aggregate fruit is derived from one flower, many carpels. So there are other structures that are attached to fruits and seeds that make them super interesting. So one thing that you'll come across a lot are what are termed arils, A-R-I-L, and that's these blue things and these yellow things and these red things over here. So on the left, actually, this is nutmeg. This is mace. So mace is the aril of nutmeg. It's not actually a different fruit. It's actually just a different structure on the same fruit. What the aril is it's actually the aril is not homologous across all angiosperms. You can have an aril that's derived from many different things, but sometimes it's derived from the integuments or the seed coat. But essentially, you might ask the question, oh, why have something like this? Well, if you were a bird and you were trying to find something to eat, you might fly, and when this fruit opens, which they do open, nutmeg is actually a fleshy dehiscent fruit. They open up and birds are attracted to these types of seeds. So you might ask, what's the cap of an acorn, right? Well, that's actually a modified structure. It's a modified series of branches. So, right, if you actually look, squint your eyes at it, each of these little things is sort of a modified little leaflet. It's a little more complicated than that, but it's a modified little leaflet, and it's just a really compressed internode, whole bunch of compressed internodes. So it looks like a little pine cone, and because it's like what's a pine cone besides a whole bunch of really compressed internodes. So compress those internodes a lot more, and you get the cap of a acorn, which is quite cool. And this is up here is cashews, and this is the receptacle. So like that's the fruit, and then within the fruit is the seed that we eat, and this is just the receptacle, fleshy receptacle, which people eat. People eat the sort of the cashew berry, if you will. And there are a whole bunch of other really weird and really cool fruits. Fruits are awesome. So the fruits of snapdragon seed pods look like skulls. This is entada. This is the largest legume in the world. It's amazing. I think it's dispersed by elephants. You have these winged seeds of alsomitra, which is a cucurbit, related to cucumbers and things like that. And then you have these weird, fruits that look like they're out of, an alien movie, but they bind on, they're hitchhikers essentially. And I think that's all I got. So that is it for screen went black. Let's see. Okay, where are we? Oh, I think I lost you all. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So here we are. That is all I have for the fruits and flowers lab lecture. But so then essentially for the lab today, or whenever you get to it, there are a series of things. So instead of having an actual online, here I'll share my screen again. Instead of having you all get some flowers and dissect them, we found this really nice resource that where you can go and you can actually dissect the flowers virtually. You're going to have to, if you follow the directions, you're going to have to enable Adobe Flash, which, it shouldn't be that big of a deal. But essentially you're going to go through and you're going to go through learn the basics section, the tutorial, and it's going to tell you essentially a whole bunch of things that I just told you. And then you'll go through and you'll choose a flower on the bottom, flower 1, flower 2, flower 3, and you'll dissect it and you'll answer these questions down here. And then that's pretty much it for the flowers. And then for the fruits, we have a whole bunch of just a series of questions and a series of images. So you have, tomato, and we ask you, where are the sepals, where's the pericarp, what's going on, what type of fruit is this? And the same thing for olives and a whole bunch of other fruit. So essentially just go through and answer the questions. It's relatively simple. And then there should be sort of like an alternative or a PDF in there for you all to look at that has a bunch of really, useful terms and stuff that'll help you both with fruit identification and also with the lab. So does anyone have any questions or anything? Cool. Well, if everyone is cool with that, then if you have any questions about the lab or anything else, you just want to chat, let me know. And if not, good luck, and I'll see you all next week.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, bye.
Bye.